What is up, guys? Now that I'm wrapping up my first ever Steam game, Phantom Tides, I wanted to do a quick little video to hopefully help anyone just starting out and to possibly remind myself of these few things I would do differently. But first, if you haven't checked out my game yet, head over to Steam and wishlist if you can. And just to make this clear, this video isn't meant to be a how-to to do these things, but more of a retrospective of these few items.
Story? What story?
So, jumping right in, and first off with the story. And this is assuming that the type of game you're going to make is going to have at least somewhat decent level of story. The big mistake I made was I knew I was making a pirate-themed Metroidvania, but that was it. So when it came around to story time, I was basically trying to fit a square block in a circle hole. I did some half-assed planning about halfway through, but it ended up not being very useful. And I think putting some time up front to really at least storyboard and get a somewhat concept of the story would have been very helpful. I was a bit too eager to jump in and just start building enemies and levels and bosses that I put the story off till very, very late. And if you don't have anybody to bounce ideas off, I'm sure there's something out there that you can use to help. With my next project, if it ends up having a decent amount of story, I'm going to definitely invest in storyboarding. I know there's a lot of apps out there to help with this, even some AI generative ones, so I'll be doing some research into those.
Designers, we've scored your designs.
Dog shit.
This one's pretty assumed, but game design should be thoroughly thought through from beginning instead of on the fly, kind of like I did. In the beginning, I started by basically piecing together different tutorials to build my controllers, my gameplay, in the various components for my game. But early on, I never really sat down and thought through the full design of how I wanted the game to play and the mechanics to be. And I really think this caused me to waste a lot of time when working on my different zones and levels, because every time I would realize and add something that I didn't have, like a double jump or a dash, I would break different areas of my levels. And for me, I think this led to a lot of scope creep, whereas when I initially started this, I wanted it to be a 6-month maximum project. But as I added new abilities and mechanics, I had to add new zones and levels and bosses to go along with them. And some of this is unavoidable, but not really planning out how my combat was going to work caused me to go back and retweak it and redo the whole thing multiple times. So whatever project I start next, I'm going to heavily invest in the design up front, and instead of jumping in and creating levels and boss fights and stuff, I'm going to try to iron out the design the best I can, because ultimately if the design isn't good, the game's not going to be fun.
This says structure. I'm hearing structure.
This one is pretty simple and may not seem like a big deal at first, but can quickly get out of hand, and it's super easy to stray from the path. And for me, I started extremely messy and then got a lot better towards the middle of development, but as I started to see the finish line, I started to get messy again. And if you're not working solo, I can imagine is even more important. In working with Unity, one of the things I got a little bit used to creating scripts from within an object. It just throws the script in the root of your assets. And I ignored this for a long time and ended up with this just big pile of scripts. And I need to go back and clean them up, but spend the extra little bit of time every time you're adding a new script and keep it organized. And as your project grows, this will be more and more useful to have a good structured project. Also, I think it's very important to keep your hierarchy clean and organized. And again, this one is simple, but it's very easy to lose sight of keeping a clean project. Next, we've got your game's infrastructure, and by this I'm talking about the core components that the game will use. Things like your save system, input configuration, sound management, music management, any sort of game managers. I put little to no emphasis on these in the beginning. I did a few tutorials on some of these topics early on, and kind of once I realized, oh yeah, I can do that, I kind of just put it on the back burner. But for example, one of the last things that I did was implement the controller layout, and I had all my button input strings hard-coded in all of my code. So I had to create a controller layout manager and go back and update all of that stuff. Whereas if I would have created that in the beginning from the get-go, I could have just added to it as needed and not had to go back and rework a lot of this stuff. And the same thing can kind of be said for the save. That is one I did a little bit earlier on, but still, you know, in several of these items, you can also look at the asset stores. I know I've heard really good things about the easy save for Unity. So I know some of these things aren't the funnest stuff to work on. So if you really need to, you can go look into those assets. But I would suggest, if you haven't done it, to go and try to build one yourself, even if you are going to use something like Easy Save. And along with game design, if this one has a bad infrastructure, your game can only be so good.
Another arts and crafts.
So I greatly underestimated how much artwork I was going to be doing, and over the span of a year, how much my art might change. My first characters and objects and stuff were a lot worse than my most recent ones, so I had to redraw a lot, as well as some of my style changed as well. So one thing I did not do pretty much at all was any sort of concept art early on, and really I only did concept art towards the end. It was more of a, you know, I needed some artwork for Steam. And for my next project, one of the first things I'll be doing is selecting a style and a color palette. One thing I did poorly in Phantom Tides was keeping track of my colors. I kind of guesstimated each time I would start a new character or item, and that led to a little bit of inconsistency.
Yeah, his time management is awful.
So this brings me to my last item, and probably the hardest for a lot of people is time management. When you get really deep into your project, for me at least, it's very easy to waste a lot of time. Sometimes I'll sit down, stare at my monitor for 20-30 minutes and not get anything done because I'm not sure what I should work on, or what I want to work on, more importantly.
Wankers! Embarrassing. Waste of our time. Waste of our time.
And for this, I've tried all sorts of things, keeping handwritten to-do lists, or working with something like Excel or Google Sheets to keep track of tasks and items and status, but typically would work for a little bit for me and then I would stray from it. So for my next project, I think I'm going to be looking into some time management software. For those familiar with like the Agile philosophy, I may be trying something like that and create user stories and tasks. But with that, I wanted to keep this quick and short, and hopefully this helps you somewhat, and I'll see you next time.